it doesn't make sense to say, well, they're just describing the same landscape with different words, because to go back to the point that Stella made initially, attributing to Foucault and others, these are not words that describe a landscape that's already there, but rather words that mobilize into existence the possibility of a landscape. In other words, they're constitutive, they're not simply descriptive. So when the military constitutes Hawaii, when they tell the story of Hawaii, they tell the story of their Hawaii. That when the military talks about Hawaii, they're looking at you. They're looking at Hawaii, but they're seeing themselves. So in Ransier's terms, what we're trying to do in this kind of journey as fellow travelers with Hawaiians, environmentalists, and others, is to alter the distribution of the sensible by practicing a different aesthetic frame. And in Foucault's terms, what we're trying to do is alter the terms of the prevailing discourse in order to deploy fresh discursive practices. So let me tell you a bit about this first example. Two women, Sterling and Summers, lived in the pre-World War II Hawaii. They were what we call Haole women, that's me. Caucasians from the mainland is what Haole means. It literally means something else in Hawaiian. It used to mean stranger, but it has come to mean Caucasians from the mainland. They lived in the Hawaii of plantations, ranches, and the military, rather than the Hawaii that I live in, which is tourism, real estate development, and the military. They watched the onslaught on Hawaiian ways by military land grabs, and attended to the stories that many different people told about the land, compiling that into a vibrant stew of representations. Their work is what Foucault would call a block of historical knowledge that's been largely discarded, but we think can be brought back into the mix by attentive, critical scholars. One of the things they did in Sites of Oahu, they just sort of, these two intrepid women on the, a tiny little budget, borrowed somebody's Jeep, and they just went all over the islands, and they collected stories, and they produced an 11-volume set of hand-copied documents and put them in the library and donated some to the university. It was a real kind of amateur, scholarly, political labor of love. And one of the things that they did to visually represent Hawaii was with hand-drawn maps. And when you compare their maps to the maps in the environmental impact statements that the military has, which are of the same landscape, but of course, remember the argument, it's not the same landscape, that the way we articulate the landscape is part of the landscape that can be. The military's maps, of course, are satellite produced, and they are entirely self-referential, which means they're maps of Hawaii that mark the spaces in terms of how the military uses them. For example, in the map of Schofield Barracks, which is a giant army base in the middle of Oahu, it has a topographical dimension. You see ridges and mountains and so forth, but there are no names, no histories, no marks of prior usage. So if we want to argue that attachment to place is an important part of the identities and memories that enable resistance, then there are no attachments to place in these maps. There are a few particulars to orient people. Whereas the hand-drawn maps in the Summers and Sterling book are very interestingly placed in relationship to many layers of prior usage. Different stories are told, different voices are brought in to say what these spaces mean. Now, I want to emphasize here just this one little small example. The difference I'm drawing is not a difference between the military's details versus the two women's more general impressions, because their maps were incredibly detailed. So it's not a difference between who really has the details and who doesn't. That's not the difference. And it's also not a difference between a deep culture versus a superficial attachment, because the military has its own deep culture. It's a deep, perverse culture, but it's not, the surface depth contrast is not what we're trying to get at. Instead, we're saying that the military's mapping strategy, their representational strategies, is a strategy of control and containment. while Sterling and Summers is a determination to respectfully transmit a besieged but still vital way of life. When you read Sights of Oahu against the background of the military's EIS, you can just see the EIS guys rolling their eyes. Sights of Oahu would no doubt appear undisciplined, non-regularized, eccentric. For Sterling and Summers, Hawaiians' way of being with the land and ocean was endangered, but not entirely in the past tense. Whereas if you look at the way that all of the hegemonic forces in Hawaii talk about Hawaiians, they talk about them in this sort of nostalgic gesture of, oh, there was such a nice culture, too bad it's gone. But meanwhile, there they are. And so it's a colonial gesture to talk about Native people as though they weren't still there. What we find in Sights of Oahu is a representation that recognizes the onslaught on this way of life while also hearing it in the present. Sights of Oahu scrambles history, science, and legend, while the EIS strives for a straightforward narrative consistency based on, as they would say, just the facts. Okay, let me give you just one other small example, and that's the way that they talk about rocks. Now, you would think a rock is a rock, right? Like a cigar is sometimes just a cigar. Well, a rock might just be just a rock. But it turns out that's not the case. That for the military, rocks are simply obstacles or accessories for their training missions. So the EIS talks about on the island of Hawaii, which we call the Big Island, that the military will engage in this process called ground softening in order to, quote, provide a softer substrate for soldiers to train. Ground softening involves using a D-10 bulldozer that would drive back and forth over areas on the range to crush the lava and the large rocks and the hard soil. Whereas from Hawaiians' point of view, these rocks are invested with significance. In the Hawaiian cosmology, rocks have names and they have histories and they have a significance that comes from the practices that were entailed around them. Their shapes and locations speak. They are tied to legends. Often they mark passages, ways of travel, or accomplishments of ancestors. Sometimes they are political economy markers. For example, a certain kind of fish would be cleaned on this kind of rock, or a certain kind of taro would be pounded on this other kind of rock. So they mark customary usages. And in this way of thinking, the boundary between the sacred and the profane is very porous. And the land is not considered appropriate for violence. Okay, so let me go from my Summers and Sterling example to my example from Kapiolani Landgraf, who is a Hawaiian photographer. And I'll just describe one of her works to you. She's done this collage that was interestingly on display in a bank building in downtown Honolulu. And you had to wonder, what did they think they were looking at when they put it up? But nonetheless, there it was. It's about 40 inches by 28 inches, so it's pretty sizable. And it consists of layers of photographic snippets and text that are penetrated from the back by giant 4-inch square-headed nails. So it looks kind of like railroad spikes driven through history. The bottom layer are photographs of 19th century Hawaiians who are always photographed looking solemnly at the camera, dressed in their Sunday best. Superimposed on those are several layers of other representations: missionaries, armed men,